Welcome in for the finale of Cole's Buckeye Corner, sponsored by Hinckley Roofing, and it is a massive week for the Ohio State Buckeyes, as it is the week of the game. Of course, as always, the Saturday coming right after Thanksgiving. Always a huge week, a lot of rivalry matchups, but no other matchup in the country matches up to the rivalry that Ohio State and Michigan have. The hatred, the bad blood between those two schools, between those two programs. The game is always a big deal, but even more so here in the last couple of years as it's gotten actually closer games. We've gotten better ones that have been close and tight. They've been dogfights all the way down to the end. Gone are the days of Ohio State going on that long run of just win after win after win after win. Unless something crazy happens, which potentially could happen with maybe hit to scholarships, maybe vacated wins, playoff ban, maybe some things that are in the works for Michigan come down the road. But again, too soon to think about that. That's going to come potentially after the season, after the investigation plays out. So we're not even going to talk about that too much because I want to jump to this game here shortly. But of course, I want to thank Hinckley Roofing again for being sponsors of this show. If you haven't done so already, reaching out to them, getting a quote, getting an estimate about seeing how much the work would be there on your roof, make sure you reach out to them here. Again, going into the holiday season, going to get to the bad weather months of the year. Again, you have time to see about trying to get some work done here before we hit the really bad weather. I would assume that as you always see in Northeast Ohio, around January, February, those times as well. So make sure you reach out to them. Again, thanks to them for being great sponsors. Hinckley Roofing, as always, appreciate them. Now, I want to also say thank you everybody out there who've watched and listened diligently through 13 weeks of me talking about Ohio State football. It's been a blast. I've enjoyed it. Hope that everybody out there has enjoyed this as well. So again, thank you for paying attention to this as we're finally at the finale. Well, recapping the win for Ohio State against Minnesota last week. Certainly Michigan and Ohio State, they had to worry about trap games. It's a time where the week before the game, you sometimes see these teams maybe start to falter, maybe stumble. They might not lose the game, but it's closer than what it should be. For Ohio State, they took care of business against Minnesota. They didn't necessarily put up as many points as I would have liked to have seen in the first half, but in the second half, they got it rolling, especially first carry of the second half. Travion Henderson breaks off a massive run, takes it to the house, and that's exactly what you want to see. So Ohio State, they stepped up. They did what they need to do at home. That's a Minnesota team that offensively, they've run through a lot of running backs this year because of some injuries. I think they have some decent wide receivers out there that I liked seeing at the very beginning of the year. Some guys who were transferring in. But defensively is where their strength is. And even though it felt like in the first half they were able to slow down Ohio State, ultimately the Buckeyes were good enough to get the job done against Minnesota and be convincing in their win. As for their opponents who are hosting the Buckeyes this weekend in the Big House, Michigan went on the road to Maryland, and Maryland made things tight. They made it interesting. Ultimately, Michigan won in the end, and on the scoreboard, it looks fairly convincing, but it was closer than what it should have been. J.J. McCarthy didn't look fantastic. Their defense was okay, but it wasn't to the level it had been earlier in the year when they were holding teams to under 10 points per game. They've given up a lot more points in the last couple of weeks, but it's still a good defense. But ultimately, things were a lot closer against Maryland, even though Maryland might be slightly better than Minnesota, than what Ohio State had. So not to the same extent as Illinois last year, where that came down to a kick at the very end for Jake Moody. But still, Michigan was tested. Some little gaps. Some chinks in the armor were definitely being shown, and everybody knows about the big chink in the armor, and that is that head coach Jim Harbaugh will not be on the sidelines. So we'll see how that affects them against Ohio State this weekend. Hasn't affected them a ton against Penn State in Maryland, but this is a different story here against the Ohio State Buckeyes. But talking about some of Michigan's players here first, J.J. McCarthy. I don't love J.J. McCarthy's play style. I don't love how he's developed. He has a lot of athletic ability. He is undoubtedly, in my mind, one of the best quarterbacks on the run in college football. I like when he's outside the pocket. I like when he's making plays happen with his feet and finding a way to throw as he's running. But when he's in the pocket, I never have trusted him as a pocket passer. That's not what he really is. He's okay as a pocket passer, and I do have to give him credit. He's improved this year as a pocket passer, but if the game comes down to the line of we can't run the ball, Ohio State's actually more physical than they were in the past years, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Can J.J. McCarthy get it done in his hands, finding some wide receivers, making some throws, working the ball down the field? He hasn't had to do that this year, and I don't necessarily know if he can do that. Now, he has gone 175 of 237. That's a 73.8% completion percentage. Very impressive completion percentage, but he hasn't had a whole lot of opportunities. Like I said, only 237 attempts. For 2,000 yards, just a little over 2,000, and 2,335 to be exact, 18 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Hasn't had to do a whole lot in the air, but he has done enough to be efficient when he's been throwing that football. The thing is, if he is to sit back and, it's not just play action passes, not some dink and dunk things, he actually needs to air it out. Can he really hurt the Buckeyes? And that's what I'm interested to see. Good quarterback, but not a great one. It's Blake Corum, a guy who, one of the few players on Michigan that I actually really appreciate. Seems like a really good guy around Thanksgiving, always doing a lot of nice things for charity. And, I've always seen things in the past couple years about him, donating meals, turkeys to people in need. Really cool to see that about Blake Corum. Just seems like a stand-up guy and somebody that I can actually appreciate there on that Michigan program with not only what they do on the football field, but also how they are off the field. And Blake Corum, a lot of credit to him. He's a guy who I'm looking forward to seeing in the NFL. Could have gone to the league last year if he wanted to. There were a lot of good running backs at the top. I think he's a guy who you have to see him, despite the size and the lack of it. You have to see him drafted in the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft this upcoming year. He's been impressive this year, as he was last year. Last year he was hurt during the Ohio State game, so he didn't get to go out there and play. This time he's going to be out there going up against the Buckeyes, and he's been good this year again. 20 touchdowns. You have to key on him. Donovan Edwards, though, the other part of the 1-2 punch has been pretty quiet this year. He was somebody who was very successful against Ohio State last year, taking all those reps in place of Corum. But he's a big play waiting to happen with his speed. He just hasn't had a whole lot of them this year. It's been Corum's workload to carry. He's the guy you really have to watch out for. The main thing for Michigan, in order for them to win again against Ohio State, of course, based on information that we've heard, investigations and things like that, it's going to be a little bit different this year. They're not going to have, a guy like Connor Stallion, somebody who can maybe know what's happening on the other sideline with the calls coming in and be able to tell you what's coming up. So they're not going to have that advantage. But what Michigan did really well, regardless of anything else, was blocking. Their offensive line just took it to the Buckeyes last year. It was the offensive line polling. A lot of times they'd have a tight end or a lineman polling, and you saw the running back just follow the polar. Happened with Haskins the year prior, happened last year. Michigan's offensive line was the difference, and what it felt like is Ohio State, with all the talented receivers they had, all the skill position players, it felt like Ohio State was a sports car, just fast, high-paced type of a team, but they're going up against a truck. And that truck was that front of Michigan. And the front in that truck ultimately beat the sports car the last 2 years. Ohio State they still have that sports car-like feel with Marvin Harrison. Of course, you're going to hear Gus Johnson call him Maserati Marv, I'm sure, this weekend. But you have him, you have Emeka Egbuka, Travion Henderson, explosive guys. You feel that sports car vibe, but at the same time, they've got a lot tougher on defense in Jim Knowles' system. That defensive line has been good. The linebackers, I think they're going to be able to crash down and see about being physical. So I think there's improvements. Are they going to be able to be physical enough to stop that run? That's going to be the key for Ohio State. If they can stop the run of Michigan, then ultimately they should win this game. And I think after losing 2 years back-to-back, sure, you're going on the road. It's a hostile environment. This is a 2 versus 3 matchup. This thing is huge. But Ohio State, as much as I have my doubts about Kyle McCord all year, and C.J. Stroud was a much better player, and it's hard to believe that C.J. Stroud lost to Michigan twice. The thing is even though McCord's not as talented as Stroud, something about the collective Buckeyes team around him feels like they're going to get it done this year against Michigan. Ultimately, if they're physical enough, if Marvin Harrison Jr. has a Heisman-like statement game, maybe a touchdown, 2 touchdowns to really help boost his resume for the Heisman, but ultimately help the team win, you need to have Henderson pop off for some big plays. If you can get a couple of those things to happen for you in this game, Ohio State, it's their time to shine, and they get this done. That's why the Buckeyes, they win this one. A low-scoring battle, a physical battle, but Ohio State, they show that they're not pushovers this year. They are physical in the trenches, especially defensively, and that's really what they need to be successful against this Michigan team. That's why the Buckeyes go on the road to the Big House, winning 23-17. The game is the must-watch game of this weekend. By far and away, no other game even compares to the game between Ohio State and Michigan. But if you want to check out a couple other games this weekend, well, because of it being Thanksgiving and Black Friday, we always get some Friday football in college. Of course, we actually have a pro game as well, first time on Black Friday, but a good slate actually for college football on Friday, and none better than my number one must-watch game. That's on Friday night at 8:30, Oregon State and Oregon. Their rivalry up there in the Northwest. They're going to collide. 2 talented teams that are both in the top 25 who have had good years. Oregon State nearly beat Washington this past weekend. Now they look to make things interesting against Oregon, see if they can hand the Ducks their second loss of the year. But the Ducks, they've been firing. They have been clicking on all cylinders. They're going to look to continue the roll that they've been on. At number 2, this is mid-afternoon on Saturday, so at the conclusion of the Ohio State-Michigan game, one that I'd want to at least check out a little bit is Wisconsin at Minnesota. The rivalry there as well between those teams in the Big Ten West and Minnesota's defense as well as Wisconsin not really being up and firing this year. I think these are 2 teams that right around 500 that both could play really tough and physical against each other, and I think actually Minnesota has a good chance to win that one against Luke Fickell's Badgers. And then number 4, Florida State going to Florida, the Gators. This is Saturday at 7 o'clock, and I think Florida State, of course, hate the injury for Jordan Travis, but I think that Florida State is on upset watch. So you have to check that one out because the undefeated Seminoles, they could potentially be in trouble in the swamp. That would be huge and shake things up come the college football playoff rankings as well right before the championship games. That puts a bow on this regular season and Cole's Buckeye Corner all 13 weeks. As I mentioned earlier in the show, thank you everybody who have watched and listened this season. It's been a good time. Of course, make sure you hit the subscribe button here on the channel. That's going to do it for me. Of course, a lot more coming up. Of course, state championships coming up in the next couple of weeks, as well as still just a little bit under, really, half a year left of the Climate Tech Inc. NFL Prediction Show, where you can hear myself and Vince McKee as well. But as for this one, sponsored by Hinckley Roofing, that does it. Go Bucks, and have a happy holidays, everybody.